Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. Our warm regards to the chair of the session, Dr. Najaswamy. In the course of this paper, Megh and I have approached the subject at hand, that is the Purva Paksha of Sheldon Pollock's use of chronology, at two primary levels. In our 5-part paper, we have compiled, analyzed, and studied his chronological data for his primary signatures in terms of both inherent assumptions as well as his theories. And in order to do a sapient and faithful Purva Paksha, we have also studied Pollock's template in relation to the master chronological template of his ancestors from the domain and as well as the traditional accounts. In doing so, we have responded to some of the questions from the position paper, even as we have primarily used the language of gods in the world of men, a rasa reader, and several of Pollock's papers and thoughts from his voluminous amount of work. In Pollock's own words, chronology is fundamental to any enterprise of comparative intellectual historical practice. As he writes in his 2010 paper, Comparison Without Hegemony, comparativism as a practice, be it in comparing literary theories or practices and traditions across cultures, must involve chronological synchronicity, void of any inherent content. It is this underlying principle that runs throughout his work and assumes particular significance when he speaks of the two great moments of rupture that marked premodern India. The first of these occurred at the start of the Common Era, when Sanskrit, according to him, was reinvented for literary and political purposes, and the second moment at the start of the second millennium. We focused on the first of these moments in our paper. With Pollock himself laying such importance to the chronologically significant moments, it is vitally important for his data and assumptions to be foolproof so that his theories can hold any water. So the first step to the Purva Paksha exercise becomes that of seeing his entire chronological framework to study it further, and this leads us to our next section of collating his data points. Megh will now walk us through this particular section.
A roadblock one immediately hits when trying to study the chronological framework Pollock uses is the near absence of chronologically sequenced data, with the exception though of one table, that of approximate dates of principal dynasties, found in the appendix of Pollock's book The Language of the Gods in the World of Men, while his work though is littered with chronological data. We found at least 140 such occurrences in various books, therefore necessitating, in our view, as the first step in studying his use of chronology, reconstructing his chronological framework based on the dispersed data. Before getting to a reconstruction of Pollock's chronological framework, one prior effort in this direction is found in pages 227 to 28 of The Battle for Sanskrit by Sri Rajiv Malhotra, an 8-row table covering epochs from pre-Buddha Vedic era until present Orientalist American goals, a starting point we found quite useful. Now, table 1 in our paper, which has 140 rows, contains not only chronologically sequenced data, but also tabulation of where in Pollock's scholarship the data can be found. 40 of these 140 occurrences in table 1 belong to BCE period. Table 2 is a similar reconstruction with 52 rows, though of only the Sanskrit texts as found in Pollock's book A Rasa Reader. When we began analyzing the data points of BCE period being the scope we have limited ourselves to, we found that of the 40 BCE data points, a conspicuous 24 lacked references. That's about 60%. We will come back to this point of lack of referencing after we've run through some basic issues to start with of internal data inconsistencies that we found in Pollock's scholarship. First, internal data inconsistency. The start period of Satavahan Vansh in Pollock's book Literary Cultures and History is circa 100 BCE, whereas in his book The Language of the Gods in the World of Men, it is 225 BCE. A simple example, illustration of internal inconsistency which becomes very, very evident once data is tabulated. Second, while in page 84 of The Language of the Gods in the World of Men, Vararuchi, according to Pollock, predates Patanjali, and Patanjali is spec to circa 150 CE. 17 pages thereafter, in page 101, Vararuchi, who earlier predated the circa 150 CE Patanjali, is now placed also in 3rd and 4th century CE. Pollock does not help himself though by correctly placing Katyayana between Panini and Patanjali, yet seeming to miss out on one crucial link found in an account of the tradition by insider Krishnamacharya in his 1937 book History of Classical Sanskrit Literature, the link that Vararuchi was also called Katyayana. Now the third inconsistency. While on page 81 in the Language of the Gods in the World of Men, Panini is pegged to 4th century BCE by Pollock, writing in India is pegged to middle of 3rd century BCE and ascribed to a new scholarly consensus without specifying though more details about those scholars or what their evidence is. Now this is an inconsistency because when one looks at the Ashtadhyayi and we looked at a 19th century translation by Srisha Chandra Vasu, one finds in book 3 chapter 2 verse 21 clear evidence for writing lipi, that is roughly script. What's more, Richard Salomon, whose scholarship Pollock is aware of, has himself not only referred to the lipi evidence but also to the then new Ceylonese archaeological evidence. Now, B.B. Lal's Brahmi pottery evidence that he dates back to 800 to 900 BCE at least only further compounds the dubiousness of Pollock's rather very firm assertion for this epoch for writing in India, some implications of which will be covered by Manogna in her subsequent section on his theories proceeding from such chronological data. Now, to quickly recap, in our new analysis of his work so far, we have instantiated 3 cases of internal inconsistencies: Satavahana Vansh, the start period, Vararuchi, and Panini and the epoch of writing. And prior to these, the insight about 60% of his BCE data occurrences that we found, which appeared unreferenced. Now, this lack of referencing could perhaps be explained if these data points are so well established in the domain by irrefutable evidence in order for them to be considered basic facts of the domain. So we decided to test it out. And we did so by looking at the data from 17 sources, 430 plus data points in total, compiled in 22 pages of tabulation in our paper, which we've called Comparative Reading Tables of Indian Chronology. Now, these 17 sources were classified broadly as outsiders or insiders, not on the basis of whether she or he was a foreigner or an Indian, but on the basis of the positions she or he takes on key epochs of Indian chronology, what we've called the ABC of Indian chronology, a 4 poison pill checklist, if you will. A. Aryan, B. Bharata War, that is Mahabharata War, and Buddha Gautama, and C. Chandragupta Maurya. Table 3 contrasts the typical positions of the outsider and insider on these epochs. And, the same person could be an insider on one epoch and outsider on the other. Yeah. Now, 7 of the 17 sources listed as outsiders, whose chronological data we've looked at, included names such as Mabel Duff, author of arguably the most extant colonial era publication focused purely on Indian chronology, titled The Chronology of India, published in 1899, in addition to the works of contemporary eminent historians like Rumila Thapar, Pollock himself, and for good measure, the NCERT Class 12 textbook too. And while we'll not go into all the 22 pages of tabulation here, this table is included here as a sample to give one a sense of how we've gone about this collation and why this may help in future research, as one can get a quick snapshot of positions of different sources across a uniform arrangement. Yeah, similar exercise is done to compile insider tables that include data of these 10 scholars, including the likes of Krishnamacharya, Kota Venkatachalam, to name a couple. Now, coming to the A of ABC, that is the Aryan problem. The first row of Pollock's data in table 1 reads, beginning of 1st millennium BCE, when, as per Pollock, earliest form of Sanskrit appeared. Note the word appeared, and again note South Asia, not India. Yeah. This is followed by Vedika Sanskrit culture being dated, or should one say, snugly fitted into the 1st millennium BCE, both with virtually no basis, certainly no explicit referencing, and clearly in alignment with Aryan invasion/migration hypotheses. Yeah. Now, given he seems to stay clear of explicitly naming Aryan invasion / migration by using words like, quote, appeared in South Asia, unquote. One is not surprised that a request for an explicit answer from Pollock on his posture towards foreign Aryan theory was sought in the MCLI related petition last year, raised by several scholars sensitive to these facts. Yeah. Now, Aryan invasion or migration theory in December 2016 educational module of Michel Denino reads, and I quote, finds no support from literary, archaeological, anthropological, or genetic evidence, unquote. This statement complements well Dr. Shivaji Singh's point in the 9th Maulana Azad Memorial Lecture organized by ICHR last November, that is 2016 November, alluding to, amongst other points of evidence, the clear and decisive Saraswati evidence. Now, the Saraswati evidence itself got recently, that is in October 2016, a month before Dr. Shivaji Singh's lecture, a resounding sanction from a range of experts, including geologists, geomorphologists, geohydrologists, in the report on paleo channels of northwest India. Now, based on evidence pertaining to loss of the Saraswati, Denino emphasizes the need to reconsider the dating of the Vedic age. Yeah, he says that in fact an unbroken Saraswati points to 2700 BCE or earlier for Vedic age, which Pollock placed in the first millennium BC, with therefore obvious implications for key Indian texts, including the Rig Veda. Yeah. Now, evidence from tradition is unequivocal, given absolutely no record of an Aryan invasion or migration, as corroborated by its equivalent absence in archaeology, further validated by modern evidence classes that we just alluded to. Yeah. Now, in fact, we are yet to come across the word Aryan, not the word Arya, the word Aryan, in any authentic Sanskrit, or for that matter, any other regional language text from Bharat's traditional canons. Yeah. Now, moving on to the first of the two B's of ABC, that is Bharata, Mahabharata war. Yeah. Now, for Pollock, outer limit for Sanskrit Mahabharat is 1st century BCE. Again, without any source referencing. Now, Sri Aurobindo, writing as he did in the previous century, wrote, and I quote, "It should be remembered that the war of Kurukshetra took place 5000 years ago," unquote. Our listed insiders date Mahabharata war to within 100 years on either side of 3100 BCE. A 1986 study of the dating of Mahabharata war, a rather exhaustive one, which analyzed the positions of 120 scholars found in the book of Veda Vyas, shows that over 50% of the scholars dated Mahabharata within 100 years of either side of 3100. Hence, perhaps a candidate for being the position of the insider. Now, since 1986, based on new methods, particularly computer-based simulation of astronomical literary evidence found in the Mahabharata text itself, more dates have been proposed, 4 of them being R.N. Iyengar, who puts it in 2nd millennium BCE, Narhari Achar and Saroj Bala in 4th millennium BCE, and Nilesh Oak in 6th millennium BCE. Okay, so now let us also quickly listen in to the position of another insider, eminent archaeologist Sri Nagaswamy ji, who is here with us right now. Can we have the video on, please?
There is a place in the Chalukya region, Karnataka region, Aihole, where there is an inscription of 6th, 7th century. There is a reference to 2 important eras. One is Kali era, which according to that inscription, it started at the death of Krishna, passing away of Krishna, 3101 BC. That is calculated. And then we have for nearly 1500 years, the Kali era is mentioned, hundreds and hundreds of inscriptions. But they don't want to say that this 3101 is considered the end of Mahabharata, and that era was started at that time. They just suppress it. We don't accept it. Somebody after so many years, they have created new era. This is not scientific analysis.
Right. So you had it in the words of Dr. Nagaswamy itself, that it is not scientific analysis. So our point is basically to be able to say that, more work needs to be done. So what we did was we looked at the text of Mahabharata itself. And there are others who have done it before as well. But we've tried to go as detailed as we could on this very specific aspect of Saraswati. We collated 120 plus occurrences of the string Saraswati in the text. 70 plus of them in our assessment are river related, not goddess related. 20 plus of them have clear estimate, even on a conservative footing, that it indicates it's not dry. Okay? Now, what that means is, just to give you a simple example, in one of the shloks in the translation by Gita Press, Saraswati ka Megh bada bhayankar tha. We are not talking about a dried river. There are people who say that the river has dried off, was there during Veda's time, but during Mahabharata, it was completely dry. Now, that doesn't seem to be on strong footing when you have verses which indicate that Saraswati ka Megh bada bhayankar tha. It might not be in the whole course, but in some places, if you get what I mean. Similarly, Kalyan Swachha Jal se bhari hui Kalyan Mahi Saraswati ka darshan. Right? Clear indications of water. We are just showing you 2 examples of the 20 plus verses that we found as evidence. Now, again, so the whole point is more research needs to be done on this and fixing this epoch before anybody theorizes on basis of these epochs as affecting society, if you get what I mean, right? So that, whereas Pollock, of course, he doesn't quote sources where he's getting these dating from, and he puts Sanskrit Mahabharata where he puts. Yeah? So now moving on to Buddha. In Pollock's work, he puts in one of the books, The Rise of Buddhism, in 500 to 400 BC. Whereas in another book, he puts it at circa 400 BC. Already a mini inconsistency over there. Now, if we take this together, and if we assume that Pollock means that it's closer to circa 400 BC, we see that he is inconsistent even with the outsiders, right? The listed outsiders, because all of them's end dates for Buddha is 475 BC, and prior to that. Now, in 2013, we have fairly recent archaeological evidence, radiocarbon dating of 2 contemporary post-hole fills, not funded by India, right? There's no bias anywhere, providing dates of 799 to 546 BC and 801 to 548 BCE. And this is just for activity at Lumbini. This is not dating of Buddha. This is just activity at Lumbini, the sacred site. And these are the 95.42 sigma dates. Now, if you look at the pure radiocarbon dating, it goes to 1st or 2nd millennium BC, pretty close to where our traditional scholars place it. Now, I'm not saying that that's firm basis, but the point is even new research is questioning the older dates, right? The older Buddhism dates which have existed. Now, such evidence highlights the problematic nature of the Mauryan horizon and the paucity of evidence supporting our current concepts of the character of the early Buddhist shrines. Yeah. Now, so you saw them talking about Mauryan horizon being not a good criteria. Now, how many of us over here know Sandrocotus? Just put your hands up. Right? I see about 5, 6 hands. Okay. So, the Chronology of India, 1899. I'm reading out the entry for Chandragupta Maurya. BC 315. Chandragupta establishes the Maurya dynasty at Pataliputra. The chronology of this dynasty and that of Buddha's date are determined by the initial date assigned to this king. Assigned being the operative word. Now, how did this come about? Before that, of all the inconsistent data that we saw in the outsiders, this one data stood out. Because everyone seemed to be agreeing on this one particular date. They're within 9 years. You know, the gap is just plus or minus 10 years. Now, how is this happening? We called it conspicuous consonance. So we tried to dig it out. And it appears that Sir William Jones in 1793 felt that Sandrocotus sounded like Chandragupta. Sandrocotus sounded like Chandragupta. So phonetic similarity of Sandrocotus and Chandragupta was the basis. Okay? Now, if you look at his own publication, there's a chronological table that we found, we can see him mapping the Hindu chronology to biblical chronology. Francis Wilford takes this forward in 1799. He further theorizes. In 1817, in James Mill's work, we see that the individual's conjecture has become the reckoning of the collective Oriental antiquarians. So from an individual to the collective Oriental antiquarians are now talking about this, simply because they're all talking about it, right? And it sounded like it's similar. Now, immediately after Mill's publication, a Cambridge publication, 1820, I'm just going to read out the title. A key to the chronology of the Hindus in a series of letters in which an attempt is made to facilitate the progress of Christianity in Hindustan. Do I need to say anything more? After James Mill, in 1838, Prinsep builds on this conjecture, and he's wanting to give it more weight. So based on Turnover's research on the Ashokan edicts, which are there to be seen, they interpret Piyadasi as Ashoka. Okay, and this has been the mainstream view. We are not saying that that is completely wrong. We are neither saying that it is completely correct either, right? And we'll show you the evidence for all of that later. This is the piece of evidence on which the chronology of India literally rests, right? This is how they've been able to link Greek and Indian pieces of history. Now, Elphinstone in 1841, alluding to Prinsep, says that this fixes an epoch in Hindu chronology to which dates of the former events may be with confidence referred, right? And in 1859, Max Muller, in his History of Ancient Sanskrit Literature, says everything in Indian chronology depended on the date of Chandragupta, that there was but one means through which the history of India can be connected with that of Greece, and its chronology reduced to its proper limits. Now, in the 21st century, isn't it imperious indeed that comparisons with Greek chronological timelines constitute the master template to frame data as against an independent study of Indian history, right? That's the argument we like to put. Again, we are not saying this is all wrong, right? What we are saying is this seems to be very dubious basis for somebody to be putting the history of our nation on the line. So Max Muller's chronological estimate, though not devoid of weak points, has, without the author's reservation, often been more or less tacitly regarded as nearest to the mark. Who says this? Jan Gonda in 1975, Sheldon Pollock's oft-repeated source, for many of his works. So what we have attempted to do over here is to trace Pollock's bias on chronological conjectures, colonial chronological conjectures, through Gonda, Muller, Prinsep, Jones, all the way to sheet anchor of Indian chronology. Yeah. Now, I'm not walking you through Mabel Duff's work, but it's very explicit in her introduction, the importance she attaches to this finding. Yeah. After Duff, Vincent Smith in 1914, Jan Gonda we already spoke about, even R.C. Majumdar could not escape analyzing this and calling it out. We're again not saying wrong or right, but that it is an assumption at best is not seemingly called out. Sridharan in his 2004 book goes on to say, and now without any difficulty fixes Chandragupta Maurya's ascension towards the end of 4th century BC. Then counting backwards and forwards from this one point, he fixes the approximate date of royal dynasties mentioned in the Puranas. So they use Puranas, like it was mentioned earlier. So Puranas are not completely wrong even in their book, but it's okay so long as it is within the limit. It is within the narrative that they would like to forward, right? So we should be careful of not judging Puranas or their use of Puranas and giving legitimacy because they use it, right? Puranas is our culture, our tradition. We should look at it from our own drishti. So the justification is not that they have used Puranas, but the point is you can see the two faces in play. Is that making sense? Yeah? Okay, so Krishnamacharya in 1937 writes, in the hands of many Orientalists, India has lost or has been cheated out of a period of 10 to 12 centuries in its political and literary life by the faulty synchronism of Chandragupta Maurya and Sandrocotes of the Greek works. But for their successors in hierarchy, who are mostly our professors of Indian history, that have given a longevity and garb of truth to it by repetition, there is to my mind no excuse of explanation, if at all, be a confection of neglect and recognition of India's glorious past in its entire truth. So as you've seen over here, we've looked at Aryan, just recap, Aryan, Bharata, Buddha, and Chandragupta, A, B, C. Now, if we don't fix BCE, what texts are we discussing in CE? Is a question that we asked ourselves. Now, it might or might not seem like the right question for everybody else, but to us it seems that the fundamentals need to be in place before we go forward. Yeah. So now I'll hand it over to Manogna for the effects on some theories.
For us authors, tracing this bias was very important because Pollock often presents himself as somebody who's different from the colonial Indologists. But tracing the evidence and leading back to this entire story was personally important. So with this chronological basis, what he does is ask some of the biggest questions concerning culture, power, premodernity, while going around building constructs of the cosmopolitan. Some of the main features and questions that he asks centers around these two great moments that we spoke of in the introduction, when at the first moment, Sanskrit emerged from the sacerdotal and liturgical environment it was confined to and acquired a new sociology and politicization of the language. Now, why did this take place and how? It took place because of the role that he gives to Western Asian and Central Asian people who entered the gambit of the Sanskrit culture. So what he does, while referring to the Shakras, is ascribe a typical, in fact, representative position of giving social change and innovation to the good outsider. He then heralds writing as one of the game-changing moments that transformed the way Sanskrit was used, and attributes this introduction of writing to the origin of kāvya. For Pollock, writing claims an authority the oral cannot, and this picture, this viewpoint, is important for his political lens, right? Because he can associate Sanskrit and its oral use with privilege and understand how the language spread when that privilege is broken at the start of the new millennium. This phenomenology, what he calls of constitutive literacy of kāvya, apparently is entirely consistent with the historical argument of placing it in the last centuries of BCE. This relationship also enables him to paint the oral order as being characterized with Brahmanical exclusivity, ritualization, and create a sort of a dichotomy for the newer millennium, where the liberated Sanskrit breaks the barrier and acquires a political role. So he already brings in a certain manifest bias towards the written and startlingly dismisses centuries of oral tradition to come to his key central points. That is, the invention of literacy and the growth of manuscript culture at the start of the Common Era led to a complex structure of socio-political change through which Sanskrit apparently began its reign across the entire subcontinent. In fact, he associates so much importance to this that he even introduces a new word, literization, that he generally gives us. Principal among Pollock's assertions is that at the onset of the first millennium, when writing came to India and the manuscript culture came, it did so in the Mauryan Ashokan period, and this again enables him to set up his second dichotomy, where he can establish parallels between the Indian setup and the Achaemenid Empire practices of the Greek. So you can again see his pet lens of bringing in the outsider as the game changer who brought in writing and manuscript. So the catalytic action is from the Greeks, and the Mauryan Ashokan model was basically an imitation of the Greek work. In the very beginning of his work, The Language of Gods in the World of Men, Pollock says that he wants to analyze the culture power practices of India without firstly even establishing if these constitute the right questions to even ask, right? So what he does is give a certain color to the language, where the older order is characterized by ritualization and monopolization. At the same tone, he also maintains that the features represented by a language hold so not only for it per se, but also mirror the conditions of the society around it. So what this enables him to do is saying if Sanskrit was confined to the liturgical in the older order, it did so because it represented the social conditions around that. Pollock also believes that in dating a few key milestones in a certain manner, he can go around establishing further parallels between outside forces and inside. And the first of these that he does, right, to establish the discursive ritualization is dating Jaimini's Mimamsa Sutra. He in fact places it in the 2nd or 3rd centuries BCE as being the authoritative text, and says that there is reason to believe that the reflexivity and even anxiety about Vedic authority that is seen in this book would have been unthinkable in the absence of a broad and religious critique that is provided by Buddhism. So what he has done is, from the entire discourse of Jaimini, he chooses to focus primarily, in fact, on the Adhikara chapter, and says that the social conditions of the day are what is reflected within that. And what he in effect does is reduce centuries of tradition that we had in the BC period to one where the culture had no other roles except that of sacerdotal and liturgical. Positioning Buddhism as the silver bullet that saved the ancient Indian from the clutches of Vedic oppression and creating a dichotomy between them is in fact a recurrent theme in Pollock's work. He maintains that a transculturation of values took place at the close of the BCE period, and that Buddhism was the influential factor. Having done that, he is very keen in dismissing some of the traditional accounts that have come up to explain the phenomenon of Buddhists reclaiming, or rather reusing Sanskrit once again after centuries of Pali and Prakrit use. And the chief of these explanations that he dismisses is the Brahmanical resurgence idea. In fact, he believes that instead of that, it is the cosmopolitan construct, which again we will see even in our second paper in the afternoon, that explains the features of the spread of the Sanskrit. So what he says is Buddhism appropriating even words such as dharma and sutra and the eventual rejection of Pali and Prakrit is an indication of how the new liberalized Sanskrit in the new millennium of the cosmopolitan construct was so powerful. And it was so powerful that even the Buddhists again took it back. The next key dating is that of Valmiki's Ramayana. So one of the key things that Pollock maintains is that kāvya could not have come during the oral period at all. In fact, he maintains that the older order, which was characterized by the oral tradition, is again very oppressive and Brahmanical control. And contrasting this with this, when he says in the newer millennium kāvya was introduced, he puts in an association with the introduction of writing, right? And he says kāvya was almost certainly composed and circulated, though not typically experienced in writing. And this as a new phenomenon appeared in India a little before the beginning of Common Era. Exemplifying best this new literary form, according to Pollock, is the Adikavyam Ramayanam, which he places so much later, just at the start of the new millennium. Pollock startlingly, in fact, even remarks that this poem could not have possibly been composed in an earlier era. He believes that the reflexive understanding of the social and discursive peculiarities of the language it employed is only possible at a moment that marked the beginning of the new cultural order. And why is this significant? This is significant so that he can introduce the influence of Buddhism on even Ramayana during the same epoch. In further trying to build a case around his bizarre dating of Ramayana, Pollock holds forth on some of the roles that Sanskrit played, or rather even not played, during the older premodern India. He says Sanskrit probably never functioned as an everyday medium of communication. It was never a bridge or a linked language, which could have been used for trade and so on. And with this rather outrageous and ill-founded statement, he says that with the exception of Ramayana, no remains of a non-sacral, otherworldly Sanskrit associated with any Vyavaharika Sat elements are even present from the earlier epoch. And thus, whereas vast amounts of such Sanskrit are available from the later period. The next pivotal work that Pollock considers is from the grammatical tradition, which is the Ashtadhyayi of Panini. He places it in the 3rd or 4th century BC. Now, how does this help him? This somewhere helps him in creating actually a very strong picture of using grammar as a tool of preserving the purity of the language and restricting those who could participate in it. He also places Patanjali's Mahabhashya into the 1st centuries of the Common Era and Katyayana's time to be somewhere between the two. It's vitally important for Pollock to date these landmark texts and luminaries close to the beginning of the Common Era, for it highlights to him the divergence of the socio-political conditions the period are set to experience, and further aids his picture of creating a sharp contrast. Pollock's constant reiteration of Sanskrit being confined to liturgical elements alone for millennia is a case for treating Vyakarana as an instrument that perpetuated and enforced the exclusive monopolization of Sanskrit. Having asked the grandest of questions at the start, what Pollock essentially does is, in answering those big questions, big-ticket questions, he chooses extremely small subsets of data to extrapolate his theories upon. In fact, this is something that we found to be consistent with his entire methodology. So what he talks about in culture becomes further restricted to literature. From literature, it becomes a smaller subset, kāvya, and from kāvya, it becomes that of prashasti. So ideally, he's going to take your data points only from prashasti, but extrapolate it out to make remarks about the entire culture. Pollock then introduces the idea of this prashasti, which is the royal panegyric, and he credits the Shakras, especially the Shakra prince Rudradaman, for inaugurating this new literary form in India. He, in fact, believes that what began with Rudradaman's inscription was not only the prashasti, but also a discourse in which Sanskrit escaped the domain of sacred and became literature. He mentions the Shakra's appropriation of Sanskrit for public political purposes at the beginning of the Common Era is an event symptomatic or even causative, just look at the words that he uses, of a radical transformation comparable in character and very possibly related to the Buddhist appropriation of Sanskrit a millennium after its rejection. Pollock, while admitting in passing, he has often maintained in methodology that when you're comparing two synchronous events, it is important not to have concomitance treated as a causality. But that is exactly what he goes ahead and does. And a chief characteristic of this new causality that he has introduced is the relationship between kāvya and rajya. Okay. We're really running out of time, so I'll quickly summarize it. Even in the second paper that we will be presenting in the afternoon, where we explore this relationship between kāvya and rajya further, it is to be noted that culture power is the main subset of Pollock's work. So he's going to analyze cultural elements through that of power. And when kāvya becomes an instrument of utilizing that power, what emerges is a desacralized, liberated Sanskrit, which has the features that make it cosmopolitan. In fact, that is something that we will be talking about in the second half of the thing. If we could quickly summarize whatever has happened, if you read in our paper further, what we do is analyze his methods and show how he has a proclivity to make comparisons that pit one indological system against another. He also conveniently places data and seems to create a connection, and if that is not possible, even force fit. Another word that we should remember is it is carefully curated data, right? Than having one which emerges from facts. As we have shown in the paper, he does this. His treatment of data includes incomplete referencing, inconsistency, sometimes even omission. And he has not made his stand clear on several conjectures, including the Aryan one, as well as ignoring indigenous and sometimes even hard evidence-based sources.
Right. And the last 20 seconds. So we've reconstructed Pollock's chronology, 2 tables, 140 rows and 52 rows just specifically for texts. Comparative reading tables of Indian chronology, 17 scholars, 430 plus data points, 22 pages of tabulations, keenly focused on ABC of Indian chronology. Evidence sources, partial, include traditional literary, Mahabharata, Saraswati occurrences, which we looked into ourselves, in addition to Panini's Ashtadhyayi Lipi, Patanjali, Mahabhashyam, Vararuchi equal to kāvya angle, Rigveda and Natya Shastra. Now, details of the kāvya relationship with Rigveda and Natya Shastra, some original work which we've done, will come in our desacralization paper. There wasn't enough space to fit it all over here. And we looked at traditional inscriptional reference, as we heard Dr. Nagaswamy say, Chalukya Aihole inscription in Kali Yuga, and modern evidence, archaeological, anthropological, geological, geomorphic, genetic. Dhanyavad.
These guys work very hard. So let's understand their data and not, that's really the way to appreciate the work. So I want to congratulate you. You've done good work. And I think the significance of your work is that, of course, he's got a lot of flaws. This work of his, over many decades, many books, many papers, has been peer reviewed by the most prestigious Western journals and publishing presses like Columbia University Press and Harvard University and this and that, passed all of that. So the issues of factual errors on such a large scale with translations, with chronology, actually is a debunking of the whole system of Indology in the Western hands. This is a big thing that we have to take on. Thank you.